Everybody, thank you for being here. Also to the people who are not enrolled in the course, to the students and other participants. We have the pleasure to have Professor Gary Fogal with us, and as usual, we are recording the session. So what I'm gonna do now, I am gonna read his bio so that it remains for everybody, and then we will get started with his talk. So Gary Fogal is an associate professor of applied English language and linguistics at Sophia University in Japan. His primary research engages a complex dynamic systems theory account of L2 writing development. He has recently co-edited a collection of studies on this topic. His research interests also explore the utility of literary texts for developing L2 proficiency. His recent publications appear in Journal of Second Language Writing, International Review of Applied Linguistics, and Applied Linguistics. So without further time, just join me in welcoming Professor Fogal to today's session. Thank you, Gary, for being here with us today.
Thank you very much. I guess I'll just get started with a screen share and ensure that that's functioning properly. And I'm assuming that everyone just sees a title slide. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, great. All right, then I'll get going here. So let me begin with a quick thank you to Enrica for the invitation and for organizing this evening's talk. Thank you, Enrica. It's an absolute pleasure to be participating, especially since I was enrolled in this research colloquium as a student almost a decade ago. And I can tell you back then that I never thought I'd be on the other side of the equation and be delivering the talk. So as such, I'm pretty thrilled to be here. So the primary aim of this evening's talk is to explore or highlight how L2 education spaces can benefit from a systems orientation or a complexity approach to teaching and learning communities. And by communities here, let's say I mean a wider swath of the educational landscape than is often considered in classroom-based research. That is, moving beyond the classroom to see how, let's say, we can incorporate other stakeholders and often overlooked variables, what some will call, and I'll later refer to as environmental variables, how we can get these into our thinking about what informs and what potentially drives L2 development. And to get at this aim, my presentation will be divided into three sections. First, I want to say a few things about complex dynamic systems theory, or CDST. I'll briefly unpack some of the terminology here, link that to what is meant by a systems orientation or a complexity theory orientation to L2 research. From there, I want to look at system mapping from the perspective of methodology. You can see a sample system map on the right. We'll have a closer look at this later. I'll discuss how it can be used and what some of its potential contributions might be. And here I'll be referencing some of the material in the readings that were distributed to the relevant students in attendance this evening. So hopefully some of what I present here will already sound familiar to many of you. In the third and final section, I'll walk us through a recent application of system mapping. We'll be looking at a study that is presently under review. So in this sense, then I won't just be regurgitating what you've already read. Instead, I hope to show you another application of this mapping technique. And then I'll conclude with some summary thoughts, and then I know we'll move into a Q&A session. All right, so let's move into this first section. Excuse me. So I'd like to begin briefly with the genesis of the actual name given to the theory that's been adopted by applied linguists, that is complex dynamic systems theory. Scholars like Diane Larson-Freeman, Phil Hiver, Marilyn Verschboor, Kees de Bott, they do a fine job of unpacking the different terms informing theory. But I want to turn to Han and colleagues in a recent study that they put together, a position paper actually, in the Studies in Second Language Acquisition. It's up on the screen here. If you're interested in CDST, I encourage you to have a look at this, because I think it borders on a must read. Essentially, what Han and colleagues unpack rather clearly and early on in the paper is this coupling of two overlapping and related interests in theories: complexity theory and dynamic systems theory. And complexity theory, as I note here, primarily focused on system properties and their relationships. Dynamic systems theory focused on processes of change and the dynamics informing development. I've heard Phil Hiver lay this out in slightly different terms, and I think that might be helpful to include here. So he talks about complexity theory, the complexity theory element as described as a relational principle, where a concern is on how different parts interact and work together or in opposition. And the adaptive principle of dynamic systems theory, where time and change are foregrounded. And as we'll see later in this talk, these two are not mutually exclusive. But the primary reason I bring this to our attention is to locate system mapping, at least initially, as squarely arising from attention to this relational principle. So let's put aside the idea of an adaptive principle for now anyway, and focus on this notion of relations and a systems approach or systems orientation to L2 research. And as I explore this complexity or systems orientation, you'll see that the two readings shared for today's class zero in on this relational systems perspective of the wider CDST approach. As we've hinted at already, complexity orientation to L2 research foregrounds in understanding of the landscape that educational practices are embedded in. So one that envisions the space or system of learning in a way that is wider or larger than what many studies to date consider. That is, a systems orientation allows us to go beyond, for example, the learner, beyond the learner and the language, beyond the learner-teacher dichotomy, and reach out to a wider community that such spaces are embedded in. So, for example, a system orientation groups together features and figures that are rarely examined together in L2 studies and can include, for instance, admin at different levels, as well as stakeholders, peers, family members, caregivers, for instance, and other affordances or obstacles embedded in the space. And the educational space appears, let's say, holistically and as a series of nested features that are constantly or consistently engaged. And we might think of these as layers of ecology or nested systems of engagement, as some scholars have suggested. And one important contribution this system orientation brings to the literature is the beginning of a response to critiques of CDST laid out by Han and colleagues. For one, that notes CDST's inattention to so-called environmental variables. Here's what Han and colleagues write. Few CDST grounded empirical studies, they say, have set out to demonstrate the interaction between the learner and the environment. The majority of studies have expressly eschewed the inclusion of environment as an interacting factor. And I'll return to this idea later, but I wanted to insert this here to demonstrate how this orientation and system mapping, when we get to it, can be used to address this critique. But back to our story here. When we look at this list and this figure, a fair question that surfaces is, how do we make sense of this messiness or this complexity? From a methodological perspective, how can we make an effort to account for all of these interacting components? How do we deal with what really looks like a headache here? One response is provided by Van Geert and Steenbeek, primarily in a piece they wrote in 2014, cited at the bottom of the screen here. In this paper, they formally introduce this notion of a simplex system. This is something I describe in one of the papers you read for today's class as a quote, meaningful theoretical structure to ground research in and an operationalizable chunk of space and time, end quote. So that is, if, as CDST espouses, everything is connected to everything else, and in order to perform any meaningful research, we need to be able to draw a justifiable and meaningful boundary around the phenomena in question. Simplex systems thinking can help with this concern. More specifically then, a simplex system is defined by these authors as a connected whole of beliefs, representations, values, emotions, habits, practices, and material tools that serve as a simplifying representation of the overarching complex system. So what we get here is an initial step in trying to make sense of that messiness, what they describe as a praxis-based forms of representing complexity. So what we're doing then is reducing the complex system to one that is simplex, one that we can be reasonably expected to handle, but one that still maintains or preserves all of the features of its, let's say, complex parents. So in this way, we are epistemically, we're still concerned with the relational principle, but we are concerned in ways that allow us to explore meaningful chunks of embedded space and, when necessary, meaningful chunks of time. And so by way of an example, what does this connected whole of beliefs, representations, values, etc., look like when we're trying to organize this as a research project? Put another way, what are some of these learner variables, task variables, environmental variables that we might look at through this lens? Well, here are some, for instance, that we could examine in a CLIL L2 writing context, let's say. In isolation, this variable set echoes previous CLIL focus studies. And so what we're setting up here is a complement to these other studies that have these variable types in mind. That is, a simplex system lens is not suggesting that looking at these variables in isolation is fruitless, right? Not at all. Rather, it's saying that we can also expand this network. That is, a systems orientation is not designed to supersede or replace. Its ambition, at least as I interpret it, is to complement. So as we begin to expand our view of the research landscape, or as we begin to operationalize, let's say, simplex systems thinking, we can see how other elements of the educational space come into play. So when looking at agents, we also want to consider individuals well outside the classroom and incorporate, for example, the influence of a writing center tutor or a cram school instructor. And then we also need to add other elements informing that space, like the motivations and experiences of different stakeholders, and even how something like curriculum itself potentially meaningfully impacts the phenomena in question. So in this way, I believe we're beginning to appreciate how a systems approach ensures that we cast a wide net and approach the educational landscape in ways that may be atypical in some research contexts. So I think we can see then, if we reflect back on this idea of CDST inherently viewing spaces with a multiplicity of connections, we can use simplex systems thinking to begin to reduce that extreme messiness. As I suggested in one of the papers I shared with you for today's class, these smaller simplex spaces serve as manageable analytic components that allow complexity researchers to examine phenomena without overtly breaking the object of study away from the larger system within which it is embedded. With simplex systems then, as a theoretical foundation, what remains to be seen is how we go about operationalizing a simplex view of educational spaces. And one response to putting simplex systems to work for us, as I presented, is system mapping. And this brings us to the second part of our So part two here focuses on system mapping as a research method. I don't want to spend too much time here because much of how system mapping is, how it works, is explained to different degrees in both papers I shared for today's class. But I do want to make a few comments about what system mapping is trying to do and why it can prove useful. So to begin with then, system mapping engages systematically and holistically with underdeveloped domains of study. This can be particularly fruitful because system mapping can help to focus future studies. That is, findings from system mapping research can provide a principled account for moving forward. And this is going to be especially useful in, let's say, uncharted territory. So the study I shared with the Colloquium students here on the use of Shakespeare in L2 secondary schools in Ontario is a good example, right? Where little to no research has explored that learning space. So system mapping can provide some useful avenues for moving forward. System mapping helps define borders and examine their permeability. This occurs both in the initial stages, where a review of the literature and discussions with stakeholders can provide an opportunity to generate a principled border. And then the mapping technique itself can help us understand the interactions that flow across different elements of the educational space. System mapping also demonstrates how agents and system variables interact. This is particularly helpful. As researchers, we sometimes can easily identify the players and the components, but what is less accessible is how those pieces interact, right? So knowing how they interact provides us with useful information that can be used for, let's say, hypothesis testing, to generate interventions, and to explore further. System mapping also highlights interdependencies that may provide insights into how and what drives system networks. For example, I did a study on an actuary science program in Thailand where the entire faculty was trained in a writing across the curriculum pedagogy, so the WAC pedagogy. This knowledge base across the faculty provided a degree of language support for students in the program, and this unity around WAC really helped drive the system forward. Or in more concrete terms, let's say, it helped the program maintain a strong positive reputation, and it helped students achieve their learning goals. And finally, system mapping can help locate where opportunities for improvement appear. We might define opportunities as places for emergence or co-adaptation. In a study I did in my own faculty, it was clear, for example, that a lack of opportunities for faculty to share their pedagogical expertise was resulting in pedagogy known to impact L2 writing, for example, attention to affective variables. This was not being implemented across a large portion of the curriculum. And so these 5 items help describe some of the features of system mapping. And when we get into the sample study, we'll see some of these examples at work. And just quickly, for those joining us who didn't have an opportunity to read the articles that inform today's class, just briefly, here's how system mapping is conducted. First, as a researcher, you need to familiarize yourself with the research space. Something like campus visits is going to help. Talk to different people involved at different levels. Decide who the stakeholders are. You'll need to generate a list of system variables. You do that by, for one, reading the literature, conducting pilot groups, having discussions with relevant stakeholders, then dividing those variables into lists like agents, experiences, curriculum. This helps define the border. So based on these first 2 steps, you can set up a principled boundary. Stenhouse and later Heidi Burns, they recommend curriculum as a potential starting point around which to think about borders, at least within the classroom context. Next, you'll want to consider a guiding question or statement you can ask stakeholders to think about as part of the mapping task. Obviously, the question revolves around what your research interests are. What are you looking at in this project? You'll need to provide materials for the mapping task, like a mapping board. I'll talk about that momentarily. And if possible, you'll want to conduct follow-up interviews, asking participants why they made decisions that they did with the mapping task. And let me say a few more things about how the actual tasks work. So each stakeholder gets a mapping board that looks like this. The guiding statement or question is placed in the center, and students are asked to map variables. So they'll get a stack of cards with one variable per card on the board, and they'll map it relative to the degree of influence each item has concerning the guiding question or statement. So if the variable is weak, it'll go in the outside nested rectangle, then moderate or strong. So once the task is completed, once all the variables are up on the mapping board, students are invited to consider the board holistically and to move cards around as they see fit. And more often than not, students will probably move or stakeholders, I should say, will probably move anywhere from 2 to a dozen cards around once they take a step back and have a look at the system holistically. Once that's completed, participants are then asked to group together with the help of a marker or something like that, variables that they deem meaningfully interact together. So what you're looking at here then is a completed system mapping board with the variables placed and the lines indicating how variables interact. And when that's finished, and this usually takes about 20 minutes or so, stakeholders are asked to comment on the choices they made. If one-on-one interviews can be done. Alternatively, I've had participants write a paragraph or two explaining some of the decisions they made with the mapping board. And these are just a few procedural details, but I've left out some as well that are in the readings. If you would like the quote-unquote step-by-step guide, just send me an email if you don't have the readings, and I can get those out to you. So once we've collected the system maps from all the participants, and we can imagine a whole set of different combinations of stakeholders involved here, depending on our topic of research, so parents, counselors, peers, teacher trainers, we can set about the task of coding. Let me do that briefly. So the completed system maps are coded according to their location on the system board. This coding framework was developed by Larry Ludlow and colleagues at Boston College and the University of Auckland. So items placed in the outer section, so those that are deemed as weakly influencing the system, are coded 1. Those that are moderate are coded 2. Those closest to the center question are coded 3. Items that are not used are coded with a 0. And at the bottom of the screen, we can see some cutoff scores that help us determine differences in how stakeholders and stakeholder groups interpret the system in question. So once the coding is completed, we can examine differences in what variables are seen by different stakeholders to influence the system and to what degree these variables impact the system according to groups. So we can also perform a cluster analysis to see differences and similarities within and across groups. Doing so can help us explore relationships stakeholders may have depended on explicitly or not when considering how variables relate to the phenomenon in question. To date, I've been using hierarchical cluster analysis because it's more sensitive to outlier groups, which is important with the groups I work with because their backgrounds and educational experiences are incredibly diverse. So with that as a brief tour through system mapping as a research method, let's move on to the final section of this talk and have a look at a sample study. So as I said much earlier, I didn't just want to regurgitate the studies that are in the papers I shared. And so I want to present a study that's under review at the moment. Excuse me, as I've suggested thus far, system mapping initially comes at the research space through the relational principle. But I said too that these two principles are not mutually exclusive. And so the study I'm going to present incorporates both of these elements. What we'll see is a series of system maps collected at different points in a semester to see how structures of relations changed over time. So as the title of the paper suggests, I was looking at how writers in two different conditions, those writing and those not, interpreted the writing space they were engaged with. There have been some really wonderful accounts as of late that detail at great length the present state of the collaborative writing literature. I direct you to these studies on the screen if there's an interest, but I want to really narrow down the focus here to highlight what the literature has to say about interaction-based studies on collaborative writing, with specific attention to the variables that have been explored in this context. So there has been first a clear focus on task and learner variables informing these studies. This is near universal in some form or another, and of course we would expect this. But when we try to understand collaborative writing behavior, we're then limited to those variable types. Greatly absent from interaction studies of collaborative writing are those focused on environmental variables. That is, those variables that inform the larger landscape that school-based collaborative writing is taking place in. So, for example, we don't know how a writing center tutor impacts a collaborative writing assignment, or how classroom-wide discussions impact a collaborative writing assignment. In this regard, there are very limited exceptions. Cho is one of them, who's an OISE grad, I should add, and then Wang is another. Both their works begin to open up the collaborative writing research landscape, but as noted on the screen, their studies explore computer-mediated collaborative writing. At present, we know very little about how students orient to collaborative writing spaces when those classroom spaces are conceived of more broadly and are seen to be part of a larger system of interacting components. So this study is focused on how students in different writing conditions perceive and interact with that larger, wider landscape. And this notion of perception is particularly important because we know from previous research that writers' perceptions of their writing spaces can impact writing development. And so I was curious about different perspectives based on these different writing conditions. The primary research question driving this study up on the screen: how do collaborative and non-collaborative writers orient similarly and differently to writing spaces over one semester? So this study took place in a Japanese university with students in its Faculty of Liberal Arts. Students were engaged in a critical thinking course. It's required of all students. The course meets twice weekly for 100 minutes each. I was looking at 2 intact classes, and the students comprise primarily of bi or multilingual students. Typically, this means English and Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Spanish. And the mean TOEFL score here is quite high. So this study also provides a rare glance at collaborative writing with students of advanced proficiency. Regarding the course itself, it's typically taken in students' second semester. Students compose approximately 15,000 words over the semester, and this is comprised of a series of near twice weekly writing tasks. So 22 papers at 500 words apiece, and then lengthier midterm paper and a lengthier final paper. In total, there's 24 essays that students need to compose. The twice weekly writing task requires students to write a response paper, primarily by synthesizing their reading of a required text. So something like a selection from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for example. So they need to synthesize their reading of that with notes derived from a professor's lecture, and then with discussions at the group and classroom level. And students are typically allotted about 72 hours to complete each of the shorter papers. And you can see that students in the collaborative writing class had substantial opportunities to practice writing collaboratively. So 20 of their 24 essays were written in a group. In addition, the collaborative writing class had 15 students, the other class had 18. So students were always working in triads. Of note here as well is that both classes had opportunities to work in different groups throughout the semester. So students spent 3 to 4 weeks working in the same group, and then the groups were reassigned. So in both classes, students worked in 4 different groups. In the collaborative writing class, the groups were used for in-class discussions and collaborative writing. For the non-collaborative writing class, the groups were used only for in-class discussions. And we changed the groups at pedagogically meaningful points in the semester. So when there was a thematic shift in the course. In both sections of the course, system maps were collected at weeks 1, 5, 9, 12, and 15. Semi-structured interviews were conducted with 8 students per class. So in total, I collected 165 system maps and 16 interviews. The mapping activity itself had students consider this question. Considering TW, which is the course title, to what degree do the following items influence writing development? So this was the question in the middle of the system map. And the variables students were asked to map accounted for writing in these different ways. So it accounted for writing over the lifespan. It accounted for writing as a community embedded exercise. It accounted for writing inside a wider curricular framework. And it looked at knowledge types required for effective writing. And I think we can see here how the variable set moves well beyond the immediate classroom space and attempts to capture the wider environmental variables informing this context. And of note too, is that these variables were selected from input from instructors and L2 writing scholars, reading the literature, as well as talking to students. All of these components are well documented in the L2 writing literature. So L2 writing scholars like Ken Hyland, Heidi Burns, Alistair Cumming, Tony Silva, Iona Leckie, all noting these are key features that need to be accounted for whenever possible when exploring L2 writing. And I should add too that the variable set was piloted across 4 groups of learners at 2 different proficiency levels. So I divided my primary research question into 3 sub-questions. Here's the first one with some descriptive statistics. The first question, what are the differences regarding how many and to what degree variables are seen to influence L2 writing development? So what we see if we focus in on the number of variables seen to be strongly influencing writing development. So these are the variables placed in the innermost rectangle on the mapping board. We see that both classes start out rather similarly, but then the collaborative writing class begins to consistently map out more variables as strongly influential, suggesting that as their experience with collaborative writing grows, so does their perspective on the number of variables they interpret as meaningful for their writing. The non-collaborative writing class has an increase in week 9, but then the numbers return to those resembling week 1, beginning to suggest that the collaborative writing appears to impact how students perceive their own writing development. And I'll talk about some interview data in a minute that addresses some of these figures. But if we wanted to put up a written summary of the figures that are on the screen, we can say that the groups were similar in their orientations at time 1, so week 1. But as the semester unfolds, so time 2 onwards, the collaborative writing group discerns notably more variables as having a strong influence on academic writing. If we look at the second sub-research question, what patterns of relations with the writing space appear with students engaged in collaborative writing and those who are not? So rather than just quantifying each variable's impact as research question 1 did, this question allows us to see what those variables are and if any patterns emerge. Here's a partial list of those variables and some related findings. This table is actually cut off because it's too large for the screen, but this table documents some notable differences and similarities and how the 2 classes interpreted the meaningfulness of the variables. So for example, across groups, so across classes, variable 2 and 10, so learning to think critically and writing feedback, these are shared in weeks 1, 5, and 9, and then variable 3 is shared across weeks 5, 9, and 12. Variables 21, 22, and 23, these have to do with different dynamics in the class. These are consistently present in the collaborative writing group in the last 4 iterations of the mapping task, so from weeks 5 to 15 of the semester, but they only appear in week 15 in the non-collaborative writing group. And again, this is just a sample of some of the related findings, but to put these into prose, the collaborative writing class linked more variables more consistently to group dynamics and interpreted the writing space as nuanced and complex. The non-collaborative writing class less consistent in their interpretation and only emphasize agents and interactions with agents in week 15.
but it's difficult to infer precisely what's driving these patterns. But the interview data can provide some insights. Due to time constraints, I can't show you all of the details, but here are some of the main ideas derived from a thematic analysis of the interviews, and I'll just focus on the collaborative writing class this evening. So first, in the collaborative writing class, we see an awareness of the writing process that students had not yet tapped into. For example, attention to time passing and the notion of iteration, so that writing task being done twice a week, right? This triggered a degree of reflection and awareness about writing that was thus far unrealized. The second theme highlights that this awareness of the complexity of the writing process appears to have stabilized over time, and we see some evidence for this in research question 1 as well. And third, we see evidence that students recognize the breadth of coverage of writing influences. That is, the possibility for engaging with writing across a wider set of variables than students initially thought, revealing possible spaces for emergence and avenues for growth in L2 writing, for example, more strategy testing opportunities. So to sum up research question 2, when we combine the system mapping data with the interview data and consider these patterns of relations I was exploring with this question, the results show that the collaborative writing class emphasized a wide and wider set of strongly influential variables early in the semester, and they maintained that perspective. They also noted multiple group dynamics, for example, among peers in small and large groups and with the instructor. They also demonstrated greater acuity to the potential that different sets of dynamics could have on their writing development. And more generally speaking, they articulated a more holistic, complex, and nuanced view of the writing experience comparatively. In contrast, the non-collaborative writing group deemed group dynamics important only toward the end of the 15-week semester and was generally less stable in its interpretation of the writing space, with extra attention given to writing center tutors in widening their perspective on writing development. All right, then let's move on to the last of the sub-research questions informing this study. I'll give you a second to read that as I take a sip of water. So to get at this, I conducted a cluster analysis to allow for different orientation types to emerge from the data set. There are too many resulting dendrograms to put up on the screen, but here is a before and after from week 1 of the study. We have week 1 on the left and week 15 on the right. We're looking at the collaborative writing class. Given the interpretive nature of cluster analyses, example, determining the number of cluster solutions, I did receive input from L2 writing scholars familiar with the research context and collaborative writing. I consulted them, so this added step helped me to ensure that the different possible cluster solutions were engaged and discussed before determining the best possible outcome. And what this analysis showed is that when we examine the dendrograms, we see that despite group differences that we see in research question 1 and 2, both classes oriented similarly across time to 2 sets of influential variables. First, we see those that focused on task and environmental variables, and there are some examples there on the screen. And second, we see a focus on learners and environmental variables. And what we have is, I think, particularly interesting because we see how environmental variables associate themselves with those variable sets, learner and task variables, that dominate how interaction studies in collaborative writing have been conceptualized from a research perspective. So this initial first step in the direction of opening up the research landscape surrounding collaborative writing appears to suggest that the inclusion of environmental variables may prove fruitful. So to answer the overall question guiding this study, how do collaborative and non-collaborative writers orient similarly and differently to writing spaces? And by way of summary, we can say first, the collaborative writing class discerned noticeably more variables as having a strong influence on academic writing, that the same class linked said variables more consistently to group dynamics and the interpretation of the writing space as nuanced and complex. And three, despite these differences, both classes oriented themselves similarly across time to two distinct sets of influential variables, those we just mentioned, task and environmental, and learner and environmental. And so where I would like to go from here is to focus the contribution of the findings around these three features that surface out of the data set. This notion of an increased awareness of the writing space, it has a positive aspect, it has a negative aspect, and to look at this expanding nature of the collaborative writing research landscape. And in doing so, I hope to underscore the central aim of this talk noted at the outset, how L2 educational spaces can benefit from a systems orientation to teaching and learning communities, the community here being educators guiding and learners engaged in collaborative writing and researchers exploring this domain. So let me begin with some positive aspects. First, as we noted earlier, an increased awareness in the writing space is known to benefit L2 writers. So this study highlights the ability of collaborative writing to facilitate that reflection and generate said awareness, and also underscores the potential contribution of system mapping to help with this. This is certainly in need of more investigation, but as a follow-up study, I'm curious to learn about how much this method can serve as a pedagogical tool. Continuing such awareness may encourage writers to attend to unexpected forms and sources of input and to engage with unexplored learning opportunities. So they might pursue extensive out-of-class discussions with peers. In addition, from a pedagogical perspective, for teachers and administrators, really, understanding learners' perceptions may help programs or instructors facilitate opportunities for students to see, reflect upon, take advantage of the wider educational context that collaborative writing is embedded in. For example, instructors may encourage writing center visits as an extension of the collaborative writing experience. Noting these positive aspects, as I said, there were some negative ones as well. And here we'll see how system mapping, I think, can help locate weaknesses in how educational spaces function and thus highlight areas in need of improvement. So first, the perception of how these variables interact to serve development was limited across classes to within similar cluster types. And this can be concerning as the writing space is centralized and it becomes restricted to defined sets of variable types interacting. This particular constraint is problematic as centralized environments, so those that curb possibilities for activity, they provide minimal opportunities for emergent behavior and experimentation that could help learners with problem solving and writing, such as seeking out new writing strategies. And these are issues we've seen raised before in previous studies. This finding, I thought, was particularly surprising in the collaborative writing class, given the expectation I had based on findings in other domains of collaborative work, that working with multiple group members on repeated problem-solving tasks like responding to an essay, that would expose students to various ways of thinking that would translate into diverse perceptions of the writing space. But the present study suggests that collaborative opportunities did not advantage the collaborative writing group in this way. So these findings can contribute to discussions about the beneficial limit or maybe the boundary of L2 collaborative writing among advanced learners. All right, and the third and final contribution, this study expands the collaborative writing research landscape. This is done first by the application of system mapping itself, and with it, the inclusion of an expanded variable set that includes environmental factors. These contributions respond to recent and repeated calls in the collaborative writing literature to broaden the scope and context of collaborative writing research. As a relatively new research method, system mapping appears ready to assist collaborative writing researchers to understand the wide landscape collaborative writing activities occur in, and then can function as a macroanalytic tool that complements studies focused on dyads or small groups. System mapping thus provides an additional layer of understanding to collaborative writing phenomena by unpacking components and operations at different levels of granularity, again addressing the notion of complementarity. And before, let's say, before transitioning to some final thoughts, just a note here on some of the limitations of the study that I think are byproducts of researching novel contexts. In this sense, all of these so-called limitations serve to inform continuing rounds of studies where some of these weaknesses can be addressed. First, there were no measures of linguistic output, such as CAF measures like complexity, accuracy, and fluency. That would be expected in a study like this that's looking at relations rather than linguistic output, but I acknowledge that many people would be curious, right, despite this not being the focus of the study. I can tell you that informally and holistically, the difference between the written output of the two classes was noticeable, with students in the collaborative writing class seemingly faring better, but I can't say that with any firm conviction, let's say. Second, due to time constraints for everyone involved, interviews were only possible at week 16. It really would have been interesting to conduct other interviews throughout the term to capture more of learners' perspectives before and during the study. And third, this is important, I think, this variable list is always in need of revising. For example, issues about how technology informed the landscape were not excluded, or social variables like socioeconomic status or ethnic or religious background, all of which have been shown to impact L2 development. But as I noted, I think these limitations, among others, also provide an avenue for strengthening the approach. So if we return to a summary slide of the discussion points, I think we can see how system mapping or systems thinking, and in particular system mapping, can help different stakeholders involved in education to better understand these localized contexts. Of course, this isn't to say that system mapping or CDST is the only means of getting at these ideas, certainly not, right? One might think of ecological approaches in the vein of Leo van Leer, or something like activity theory as it's seen through a Vygotskian social cultural theory lens, as approaching phenomena from a perspective that accounts for holistic, community-wide systems orientation to L2 learning spaces. But within a CDST framework where system mapping is grounded, I think in addition to revealing important features of localized learning environments, system mapping can also serve to inform the wider discussion around CDST. And that's where I would like to turn to now as a way of wrapping up the presentation by addressing one final set of ideas that reconnects to the primary aim of the study. But I want to address how system mapping can expand beyond contributions to localized contexts and can contribute to wider discussions informing L2 research. So first, the piece by Han and colleagues that I noted earlier in the presentation has this concern about CDST research, that its limited studies investigate interaction between internal and external resources. The chosen scope of the system is too often narrowly focused on learner language, and it ignores environmental influence. They argue learner environment interaction is under-investigated, they suggest. So the focus of much CDST research, according to Han and colleagues, is on learner language as a standalone system. So think of CAF studies, for example. System mapping helps to address this concern by fronting both internal factors like learner, classroom, teacher variables, and external or environmental factors like administration, writing centers, previous learning, peers, etc. The next concern noted by Han and colleagues is that system mapping may address is this. CDST studies very often make arbitrary decisions about what constitutes a system, lacking both principled reasoning and an organic basis, they argue. As I hope to have shown this evening, system mapping takes as its starting point a principled account of what comprises a system, and does so by consulting with various stakeholders and scholars, a review of the literature, and when possible, piloting what those systems might look like with the relevant stakeholders. Moving away from Han's critique, but directly related to this, is another contribution, namely that system mapping addresses the well-referenced boundary problem, that is, concerns about how to delineate a system of study that is infinitely connected to other systems. So as we already noted, system mapping provides us with some direction there. It also seems very plausible to me that system mapping can serve as a meaningful awareness-raising activity for students. In this sense, and this remains to be seen, and like I said earlier, I'm eager to get into a study that examines this, but system mapping may address Ushioda's important concern, and others have echoed this, Lourdes Ortega, Nina Spada, that we have a responsibility to ensure that our probing and testing of students be grounded in research methods that are pedagogically sound. So the ability for system mapping potentially to serve as a meaningful awareness-raising activity could address this. Next, system mapping contributes to increased attention to localized educational environments. This attention to localized pedagogies comes at a time, I think, when many L2 education researchers are increasingly interested in exploring regional particularities rather than relying on universals or a one-size-fits-all approach. An outlook, I think, that pairs well with attempts to impact local education systems. So researchers interested in more localized, context-heavy studies might consider system mapping. And finally, where I would like to end is by highlighting once again the complementary nature of system mapping. In the final chapter of a 2017 edited volume by Ortega and Han that celebrates the life of, the career of Diane Larson Freeman, Han and a different set of colleagues, they're commenting again on complexity theory and complex dynamic systems theory, and they address this notion of complementarity and granularity. And I think system mapping has something to say here, but they underscore the importance of diverse perspectives in our field. And the authors remind us that multiple lenses are required if we really want to get at what language development looks like and ways we can go about impacting those processes. There's a great quote from the New York Times in this piece by Han and colleagues that discusses which is better, a view of the Grand Canyon from a helicopter or a view of the Grand Canyon on foot. And the conclusion they reach is that both are equally beautiful and both are required to appreciate the landscape. And in this regard, as we expand the metaphor here, system mapping is able to provide a grand sweeping view of the educational landscape like we see on the left, but we still most certainly need those finer grained studies like we see on the right. And I think this is something that our field has long recognized since at least the early 1980s, if not earlier. But I think it's a worthwhile reminder that more than one lens or perspective is needed. And I hope to have shown how system mapping and its orientation to the educational landscape can contribute to the wider picture of L2 learning that we're all trying to better understand and facilitate. And I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Gary, for this